Father, thank you for the opportunity we have to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to get a deeper understanding of what grace looks like in our lives and how we can accept the gift that's been given us without trying to trade for it or anything. I thank you that you are so persistent and so tenacious in your pursuit of us and our hearts, and allow us the courage to be able to share that and to be seen and see others as groups get underway, and slowly but surely invest in a quiet revolution of community here at CCU. I pray that over our groups as we start up. So thank you for your love for us, and guide us into the truth that you have for us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So let's see. We had ended, I believe, on this idea, and the idea of accepting the gift as it's given, and ultimately, when we understand the immensity of the gift that's been given, then it opens the window to humility, and actually owning our own needs. See, the one kind of telltale sign of someone who is beginning to grasp what grace looks like is when they begin to own their own needs unashamedly, and I say it that way intentionally. They are willing to ask to have their needs met, and they're willing to have people say no, not right now, without sinking back into shame again. So all of what you're going to be doing in groups is investing in this idea of learning instead of knowing, and learning to engage in the kind of courage that we've been talking about, and that is not going to be a consistently upward trend. Okay, that's so for everybody. Is that it might be a big step forward and then slow down or stop, and then another step forward and maybe getting kicked back a little bit. That's all part of it, and grace gives us that kind of capacity to see that without saying, what a loser am I that I can't just keep moving, or I should be able to handle this stuff, or I should know this stuff by now, or whatever the phrase is. And I guess I would challenge you to pay attention to your internal narratives, because they will kick into high gear when we go into groups. They always do. And those narratives are the places where you'll see what the kind of the internal universe is like within you. And that's what will be kind of tapping on the brakes as you're invited to share what life is like and so forth. The folks that have been in the grief and loss groups, these groups end up being a little bit different, partly because they're not quite as focused. Okay, I mean, when y'all were in the grief and loss groups, we had a very clear focus. So we were talking about grief and loss and how it shows up. Shame and grace. I mean, if you think of concentric circles, the outer circle is where we lose relationships and other things like this. When we get in tighter, that's where we find the shame and grace stuff, because it's closer to where our heart is, which means it impacts everything outward as well. So, when we were talking about grief and loss in the spring, we were also talking about shame at the same time, if y'all will remember. I mentioned it throughout, and how much these two classes tend to kind of link together, because all of the shoulds start flying in about how I should handle this loss, how I should behave, how I should do this and that and the other thing. And this is kind of the core of that whole thing. So in a lot of ways, the groups with this class, even though you've had one before, for those of you who have been in it before, even though you've had that experience, it's not going to be the same, because this is a wider focus, way wider focus, which means that then you have to choose what you're going to pay attention to, what you're going to share with people. And that makes it harder. I mean, honestly, I want to I want to set your expectations so that you understand that getting going is not going to be nearly as easy. I mean, when I ask somebody, have you ever experienced a loss, they can tell you the facts of that really easily. They can tell you, chapter and verse of the people or the relationships or the other things. But then when you move in a little farther and say, yeah, but what did it mean to you? Whole different matter. I mean, these guys that were in the group class before you heard me say the same thing. What does it mean to lose that person? Now we're getting into where these narratives tend to hide, even within our own hearts. So any discussion at all about grace has to also include a discussion about the well. And this is a preview of what I'll be talking about on Tuesday. Now, if you all have been watching the calendar, the symposium is next week, and we're going to get bitten by it. So what that means is that you're only going to have group next week. You're not going to have the lecture. And I'm doing a workshop that is entitled "The Way of the Heart," and the grace enters into how we handle the well of our heart. And Proverbs makes it very clear. It's the wellspring of life for us. And so when I've talked about boundaries and having a chain link fence around it and being clear about what I'm responsible for, if you can imagine, on that property of yours is this thing called the well, and that's your heart, and that's what you're responsible for. And how I handle my heart is connected to grace and shame very intimately, because in a lot of cases we have a Jeremiah 17:34 view, 34:17 view of the heart. And you know what that is? The heart is desperately wicked. When it talks about watch over your heart in Proverbs, it's not talking about something that's wicked. It's talking about something of immeasurable value. Literally in the Hebrew, the watch over or guard or things like that is probably closer, because it's talking about the word that's used is always used in the king's guard that stand in front of his treasury. That's what the image is invoked with that word. And so the same thing is true when we're talking about our hearts and what we do with it, is that we think that it's so wicked, I just have to punish it all the time, because that'll get it to shape up, versus the heart that we've been given, exchanged for, and that heart is part of the new covenant, and what we're called into is God saying, literally, I'm going to give you a new heart, and out of that heart you live, rather than beat the snot out of that heart so you avoid certain things. And that's a bigger part, I think, of what we have to talk about. The other thing about that is the concept of the well and what goes into it. And I just thought of this, and let me read this to you. Some of you guys have heard this before, but I meant to get this pulled up and I forgot about it. And what where is it? Let me just read this to you, and then rather than you watch it up here. Where is the top of that thing? There you are. The excuse me, the keeper, it's called the keeper of the well, and the I'm not finding it. I'll read it to you next time. But essentially, it's a story that is told by the former chaplain of the Senate, and the story, as the story goes, it's about an old man up in the mountains who takes care of a well. And everything below it benefits from it. And ultimately, I think we have that same charge, is how do we care for the well that is our heart. And grace is really the essential ingredient, if you will, of being able to do that. So most of the time, the one thing we tend to get distracted by is looking at all the things that are downstream of the well. So we don't take care of the well, we take care of all the things that are downstream of the well. And so all sorts of trash and other things show up down there, and we end up paying attention to all of those things, whether it's an addiction or pornography or whatever it might be. We pay attention to all those things, and then we move those out of the way, say, there, I finally got it cleaned up. But then it just corrodes again, and it keeps collecting trash because we have not worked our way upstream to check to see what's going on in the well. Because if we take care of the well and it flows clean, then the downstream stuff will eventually be cleared out enough for it to not continue to accumulate. And that tends to be our strategy, and shame is built on downstream stuff. It's not built on embracing and understanding what the well of our heart really is all about. So a couple different places Jesus held people accountable for this, and we're relatively familiar with this, where Jesus calls them a brood of vipers and basically says, out of the overflow of your heart the mouth speaks. And so oftentimes I think apparently I have a fairly annoying characteristic of noticing what people actually say. And they kind of count on me not paying attention to it. Right, Anthony? And the fascinating thing about it is that the terms we use is the inner narrative we use. And so when I pay attention to that, I get a direct window into what's going on in their hearts. And it's not for condemnation's sake. Not in any way, shape, or form. If anything, it's for empathy's sake, because I get it. So we all know how the Pharisees responded to this. You know, they said, we're vipers, huh? Okay, let's kill him. Rather than, oh crap, there might be something wrong with our hearts. Here's another one. It's out of Luke. Same thing, very similar. Good man brings good things out of the good treasure of his heart. The evil man brings evil things out of the evil treasure of his heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. See, the thing is that if you want to build empathy, listen to people. Because you begin to see how ruthless oftentimes they speak of themselves. And that can't really engender anything but empathy, because we all do it too. We hear the same kind of narratives, and we're afraid to say anything about it because we don't want to embarrass somebody or whatever. And the irony is it's not necessarily an embarrassment. It ends up being an empathic response to say, yeah, me too, I get that. I do that same thing. I know what that's like. So grace and the well is absolutely essential, really, I think, as far as our own growth is concerned. So ultimately, and I'm landing on this so that you don't forget it, what is the issue with grace? Why is it such a problem? And we've been developing this, but what's the issue? Well, first of all, it violates our sense of justice and punishment. We don't like the idea, and usually the way we characterize it is somebody going scot-free. And that's the justice voice in us speaking. That we want justice, and grace does not cooperate with that. In a lot of cases, which is ironic, is that, and this goes back to our Q&A that we had last class, is we don't want to forgive people and give them over to God because we know He will. And we want to be judge, jury, and executioner. And so grace violates our sense of justice and our sense of punishment, including self-punishment, I might add. So the second thing is it's free. And while I know you all know this, we can't oftentimes help but feel obligated because grace is offered us. And the funny thing about it is that when we get obligated and we act as if we've been obligated by grace, like in other words, what do I need to trade in order to be worthy of this grace? I've just cheapened it. Because the power of it is the fact that it's a gift and it's free. So it costs the receiver nothing and the giver everything. And in a lot of cases, when we consciously, maybe even intentionally offer grace to somebody, not sidestepping consequences or anything like that, but even remaining in relationship can be a gracious thing to do, even in spite of hurt. It cost me everything. There have been numerous times where, I have stuck my foot in my mouth with my wife. I know, it's a shock. And she's hurt. And yet, she doesn't ostracize me or give me the silent treatment or anything like that. She simply takes the time to say, ouch. Which is remarkable because there's everything in us that wants justice. Everything in us wants justice. Because that makes sense. The world operates in balance that way. And so, it costs me nothing. She's offering it to me. But it costs her everything because it's like she's quote unquote ignoring. And this is how our thought process tends to go, is that if I offer somebody grace, that means what they did was okay. We use those same words with forgiveness. Same words. And it doesn't mean anything of the sort at all. But that's how we've framed it. And so grace lets somebody off without any consequences. The problem is we don't get to orchestrate the consequences. That's the issue. And being close enough to be able to see them suffer the consequences so we get some of the vengeance out of the way. Another one is that it's a gift. We've already said that. It's meant to communicate worth and value. When I give somebody a gift, whatever that might be, whether that's encouragement, a gift of encouragement or support or whatever it might be, it's meant to convey the worth to the person, their worth and value. Oftentimes we have a hard time with compliments, not because the person's nice, but because of what our internal narrative is saying about us to ourselves. And we resist the compliment because we don't want to be prideful, we don't want to be seen as arrogant, we blah, 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 all the things that we don't want other people to think and do. But ultimately, a gift that's given reestablishes the image of God in that person, and that's exactly why. Even in the film clips I showed you from Les Mis, that's exactly the dilemma Jean Valjean had when the priest gave him this free gift. And it put him on the horns of a terrible dilemma because he had already set his mind to hating the world like the world hated me. That was his agenda already. Suddenly it gets blown up and he says, I have worth and dignity and I have a soul, and the priest instantaneously institutes and establishes the image of God in him, and he knows he's in trouble. He knows he's in trouble to such a degree that he cries out, is there any other way to go? We'd rather go back toward justice than go toward grace. Yeah, Olivia.
I guess I'm confused about the it costs the receiver nothing and the giver everything. Like, how does it cost the giver everything? It makes sense that it costs the receiver nothing to me,
right.
But what does it cost the giver if it's not even something that can be?
So, what do I surrender by offering grace?
Yeah.
No, I'm asking you.
What?
And anybody that wants to save her from her own misery, you can do that. What do I surrender by offering grace? You want to call the helpline?
Well, you surrender your own will.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Me?
Yeah. You're the only T-Rex wave over there, so.
I think thinking of particular situation, like last semester, causing both kind of like the pride of like, I don't know, like of other people being like, oh, you shouldn't like be friends with this person anymore. Like that would be, I don't know, just like the own pride of like that's not, I don't know, look, I don't know.
I've got to sort through the I don't knows to get to the point here. So you surrender other people's opinion.
Yes, yeah.
I'm glad we found it. Yes.
And then, like it almost makes you look like you have bad boundaries. When maybe I do.
Farther in you go, JZ. It's like, oh man, I'm getting in trouble. I better.
Okay.
Helpline, please. Yeah.
But then also like now, like still seeing this person, like almost like they don't realize the grace I've given, and like kind of being like mad at me all the time and like punishing me, kind of it feels like. And then like having to like think back, like no, I've already forgiven that, and like redo that.
Release it. Yeah.
Every time I see this person.
Sure.
So yeah.
Okay.
Like, more ongoing thing rather than just like one day.
Okay. So I surrender my will. I surrender managing other people's opinions. I surrender my demand that the person make the changes I think they should make. Okay. Yeah, Elizabeth.
And we also surrender the control of their consequence. You surrender making them pay for what they did.
Okay. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, Matt.
You also said that like everything within us wants justice, and so like it is a self-denial, and although it isn't like a pain of something physical or literal, it's like I'm paying with the pain that it causes me, how difficult it is for me to do that, and how little recognition I might get for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Which sounds like something pretty big. I mean, look at the short time we have the surrender of the will, surrender of the sense of justice, the surrender to continue to pay consequences or make them pay consequences, the surrender to, how'd you put that? Yeah, I'm going to do to you what you do to me. What'd you just say?
I don't know.
Oh, I feel so much better. I'm vindicated. I'm 60-something, you're 20-something, and you forgot it. Good. At least we're there. Yeah, Laura, go ahead. Yeah.
It was like self-denial.
Yeah, self-sacrifice and self-denial. Yeah. That sounds like a lot. Yeah, she saved you. Too bad I can't get my wife here to save me. That ends up being a lot. And in a lot of cases, what we surrender is the notoriety. That's why we often say to people, well, I want you to know how much grace I'm giving you. Yeah. So, and it goes to your point, right? Is that the one thing that is probably the most annoying of grace is how seemingly invisible it is. And yet it's still given. I mean, if you guys get to the point of being parents, you will find out what the world of grace looks like. Because you will be living the living embodiment of grace to your children. I mean, the fact that they make it out of adolescence will be a gracious thing. And I remind them of that regularly, now that they're 30-something. Don't quote me or Corey will deny it. So yeah, I mean, actually, if anything, when we look a little bit more closely, we actually see the immensity and the lavishness of grace when it's offered. Because the human heart tends toward justice, not toward grace. And so when we're offering grace, not only do we have this reestablishment of the Imago Dei in them, it's the reestablishment of the Imago Dei in us too. Because that's the reflection of God's heart, is that grace that we can look at and talk about. So the other thing that comes up, which fits into some of this discussion already, is that there is no quid pro quo. This for that. The heart of shame is contracts and trades. The nature of so many of our relationships is a trade or a contract without really even knowing it, that it's that way. And that's where shame enters into our relationships. Because if I can keep the trade, if I can keep the balance beam kind of even, then we're good. But if it starts tilting too far in one direction or another, then either I get angry because it's tilted too far my way and not far enough their way, or vice versa. But the heart of grace is a covenant. And the one thing, if you want to see the thread of grace through all of Scripture, just look for the covenant God has with his people. And the prophets often refer to that. Is God always ends up kind of pulling himself back from the edge, from completely destroying them, which is gracious. And so the covenant he made from the very, very beginning with Abram to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob's sons, and continuing on beyond all of that, is this vein like gold of grace all the way through. And then it gets to places where the prophets that are most aware of the nature of man's heart, and God's saying, I will turn their heart of stone into a fleshy heart, one that responds to me, and I'll write their law on their heart, so they'll respond from their hearts rather than complying with a law. And it foreshadows what Jesus came to accomplish. And so the only catch to grace is having a heart that's open to receive it. And we see that right in Les Mis. Valjean's heart was open to receive it. It opened over time. It did not open instantaneously. Jovert's heart was not open, and it led him to a very different response to when grace was given him. Yeah.
Do you think it's hard for us to receive grace because we constantly want that justice even like on ourselves? So it like makes sense to us?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we've grown up with the motto, if you will, that if something's been done wrong, someone has to pay. Someone has to be punished. And so if I'm not going to be punished, I'm offered grace, I will do it myself. So in the extreme, we see examples of that all around us, okay? Including denying good from ourselves as a self-punishment. And I have seen that consistently in a variety of relationships over the years, where somebody has decided that they're not worthy of grace. And when they're offered it, a little bit like Javert, they don't know what to do with it. So they lapse back into sabotaging good and self-punishment, in a sense. And that's kind of evens the balance, because it satisfies our bloodlust for justice rather than the free, life-giving grace that's offered us. And that's a hard re-indoctrination that we have to undergo. And that's one of the reasons why, I pound the table about community so much. Where else am I going to learn that? When somebody offers me grace, I grapple with the fact that I want to punish myself, and I bring that into relationship. And now we're talking about it, and suddenly I can ease up a little bit and lean into the grace that I'm being offered, and find out that if I'm going to fall, kind of like a trust fall, somebody is going to catch me. And then it's like, oh, maybe the world doesn't work the way I thought it did. So I think a lot of you probably have gone through Psych 101 and seen, if this brings any memories, maybe horrible, but back is the upside down glasses. Do you remember, have you ever seen the video for that? Some of you have. And they did an experiment with this woman, and they outfitted her head with a headpiece that had a mirror in it. And so, and what it did was, it literally, she looked through the mirror and the world turned upside down, literally. And it took her, well, some of you might remember, but do you know how long it took her to finally pour a cup of tea that way? Any guesses? 6 months. Okay. What else?
8 days.
You remember. Yes, 8 days. Which is absolutely a world speed record. Really, I mean, when you think about it, her brain rewired itself in just 8 days, including going to the bathroom, including typing on a computer, including writing her name, all of that. And then when they took it off, she got sick. She had vertigo that very nearly caused her to throw up. So what does grace do? Grace turns our world right side up. And we say, no, give me the upside down glasses back, because I feel sick. And that's, until I started showing that video, I used to talk about that all the time in therapy with people, is the upside down world. And suddenly I'm walking into a world with people that are seemingly standing on the ceiling, and I get caught by the idea that actually I'm the one upside down, and if I live in the right side up world, I might actually experience stuff I never, ever, ever thought possible, because I've been seeing the world upside down the entire time. And see, we like our comfort. We like our comfort, even if it hurts us. At least I'm in charge of that. But I'm not sure I want the trust piece that comes with grace, and that's part of even some of the conversations I think we have. The last thing, which was where we started, is that it's scandalous. The notion of God's love coming to us free, no strings attached, seems to go against every instinct of humanity. Only Christianity, and you read this in Philip Yancey's book, only Christianity dares to make God's love unconditional. The fact of the matter remains that in the Bible, God seems to have a marked preference for real people rather than good people. Which calls all of us out. Because oftentimes we lapse into one or the other. Sometimes we're forced into the real because we can't avoid it anymore, and people have already seen it, so we're already outed. But we settle for the good and looking good. And as I've said in here and other classes before, there's a little Pharisee in all of us. We all want to know how well we're doing compared to others. We want a rule or a yardstick to know how well we're doing. And the minute I start asking for measurement, I'm probably refusing to trust. And that's the challenge. See, the voice of shame seems to make complete sense, because it's about justice, it's about regularity, it's about consistency, it's about, law. At least I know that. So the major issue with this is not only is there's no quid pro quo, it's free, it's a gift, and it's just downright scandalous. And literally, Jesus was called the scandalon in Greek, which means the stumbling block. So the irony is in the statement, the first statement up here, that Christianity dares to make God's love unconditional. That is the stumbling block for Christianity. There are lots of people that say it's just too good to be true. It's not possible. It's just not possible. And they might add, because it's me, that it's not possible. Not that God is so big, but because I am so broken. And God doesn't accept broken things. So, and again, you can do chapter and verse of people, the parade of characters that are broken. I once was toying with the idea of writing a whole book on Jesus' interactions with broken people and what was unique about it. And you can watch the march, pick a gospel, any gospel at all. And besides the scads of people that were sick and demon possessed and everything else, but the woman at the well, the woman who was caught touching Jesus, the leper at the pool of Bethesda, not the leper, the lame guy, all of that. And what you end up seeing as a theme is Jesus he asks them to own their need. Think about the man at the pool of Bethesda. What does Jesus ask him? You're all Bible scholars, you know this.
Do you want to be made well?
Yeah, do you want to be made well? That's an ironic question coming from the Son of God, isn't it? So he's asking the man to own his own need. And he provides the context of grace for him to actually be healed. And Jesus brought grace with him. We all know that. So, okay, we are going to turn our attention to something way more comfortable. What's that, Ethan? Just stop coming?
You'll hear it on there. I said nonstop lies.
So the whole talk is, right? The scandal of grace and the comfort of shame. And that's, another way to put it, but it's a bigger mouthful, is the stumbling block of grace and the comfort of shame. So where we start is places that you're familiar with, having read Brene Brown. It's connected to our identity. That's where it gets its power. That's why it is so powerful. It's the threat. Its threat is from the threat of rejection and disconnection, which is at the heart of the image of God in us, is connection and relationship and and community. And oftentimes it ends up being used to change others' behaviors and to protect ourselves. See, the thing is that we're living in a world, we're living in a culture that really is very shame-prone as being diplomatic. It's shame-based. And so at some level, I think we all know that the people that we are interacting with are functioning with the very same basis in terms of shame. So it threatens our sense of belonging. We feel cast out. We feel alone. And the reality is we're being rejected for who we are, our being, not our behavior. The one thing that I have found more and more over the years, even as I've talked to people, is it's not only feeling alone, but it's also feeling alone and empty. Because grace creates this context where we can actually be filled. But shame does not. It literally it drains everything out of us because of its fundamental kind of strategy of attacking who we are, our being, not our behavior. Now, clearly, when we start talking about trafficking in, and I'll go back to grace again, what are we talking about? We're talking about behavior change that is motivated by a heart change. It always starts with the heart. It always starts with the heart. It doesn't mean immediate behavior change, but it does mean that once that heart, take the glasses off, once I start to reorient it toward different assumptions, different thoughts, then behaviors tend to follow after that. My choices are predicated on grace rather than shame. So the whole idea of feeling cast out, marginalized, I don't fit. See, a lot of times all of those phrases tend to give away the fact that there's some sense of shame that's being discussed here by the person we're talking about or about ourselves, okay? So the one thing that we don't have that we need to find a way to develop is not only a vocabulary, words to use to describe it. See, this is the interesting thing, is that when when you ask people, for example, just a real easy one, how do you feel? And they say, I don't know. Or worse yet, they say, fine. In most cases, people do not have a very developed feeling vocabulary. Okay? I mean, I think, I'll have to check, but I think I put it in course resources, a feeling sheet. You might want to bring it to group. Might be helpful. No, Julie? Oh, come on. Be a sport. And most of the time when I show, and I've had this happen so many times in counseling, I will give this, because I would have a file drawer, and I had a little file folder in there expressly with all my feeling sheets in it. And I would get it out and I'd give it to the person, and their eyes would get big, and it's like, there are that many feelings? Yeah, there were over 100 on there. And it's like, what do you feel? I don't know. Mad, sad, glad, bad. SCAD, if you're from New Jersey. The big five. And there's an entire continuum around those, and we have no vocabulary for it at all. You know, what's the difference between perturbed and enraged, for example? Yeah, never heard that word? Upset. I'll use a more common one. But see, the same thing is true. We have a better vocabulary range with words of joy, happiness, things like that. But the ones that are connected oftentimes to our woundedness, we don't develop. Why? Because if I have a word for it, then I have to name it. And if I name it, it becomes real. And if it's real, then I'm, pardon the phrase, up shit creek without a paddle. I'll just call it for what it is. Don't quote me. Oh, I want my job, I think. So, we don't have a vocabulary for shame either. We don't have a vocabulary for this either. We lack any vocabulary to understand what it is that we're experiencing. And see, without words, we lack the ability to expose it, which really is the key strategy. And you've read in Brene talking about bringing it into relationship with people that have earned the trust to be able to speak it. But it becomes real when I speak it, and we all know it, and that's exactly why we don't develop the vocabulary and we don't speak it. Because it literally becomes real. And I don't want it to be real, so I'm not going to name it. And it hampers our ability to respond to it in any way without a word to call it. So without the words, we only experience it, and that's it. We don't develop the ability to actually deal with it in any kind of healthy way, self-monitoring, self-awareness, things like that, because we haven't developed the vocabulary to actually talk about what it is. Most of the time, what we do, since we don't have a lot of words for it, we use similes. It's like this. Okay? That's what we tend to do. But I think it's important that we develop some vocabulary around it to understand what's the beast here that we're talking about. So it gets its power from one being hidden and unidentified. And anything that's unidentified ends up becoming bigger than it oftentimes is. Now, it's bigger than it is. It is reality. It's bigger is how I see it. Okay? Because it dominates our view. I mean, that's the reality of what shame does. It dominates our view. As a matter of fact, it so dominates our view that it filters out everything. I went into the optometrist a couple weeks ago, and Matt and I were talking about this, and I have something called monovision. Has anybody ever heard of that? You might have contacts that are monovision. No? Okay. It's correction in one eye for distance and in the other eye for close up. So, and I had surgery for it. I had LASIK surgery, and the doc said, he said, you want to go the monovision route? It's like, what do you mean? I wear a monocle or something? What are you talking about? He said, no. He said, it's amazing to watch how the brain will wire itself when one lens in the eye is geared for close reading, and one is geared for distance. Okay? I'm right eye dominant. And so I literally, when I'm in the optometrist doing the eye, hold your eyes over, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm net 20/20. Net 20/20, which is way better because I've been wearing glasses since kindergarten. But she had me, the little paddles, right? You put it up front and all that jazz. And then she gave me one that was perforated. It was like, what are you doing to me? And so she said, hold it over your distance eye. And what was amazing is that when I did that, I could actually see. And that's how she checked my 20/20 vision in my distance eye, or my close eye, I should say. And I said, well, wait a minute. As this, psychologist teaching sensation. What are you doing here? And she said, when you have something that's perforated, it limits the eye or the light rays coming through into your eyes and focuses it closer up, which allows for the eye to see something it wouldn't otherwise see because it's geared for longer or close up. Get the picture? Shame does that. It filters out the stuff coming from our outside world and focuses it in on the things that are wrong about us. It does exactly the same thing. And it was like, thank you for that metaphor. I really appreciate it. I will work it into my lecture this week. And shame is it. And so you guys know what it is, okay? You've seen this definition before. The intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed. First condition, all right? The first condition is the painful feeling or experience of that we are flawed. If you stop right there, all of us would say, yes, count me in. What goes farther is, and therefore. That's where the conclusion is. And the conclusion is this: because I am flawed, I am unworthy of acceptance or belonging. That's the fatal conclusion. So what comes out of it in our response is embarrassment and guilt and humiliation and shame really end up all being very different emotional responses to this feeling that we carry around within us. See, I think the fact of the matter remains, all of us would agree that we're flawed. I don't think that's a news story to any of us. But it's the conclusion that's fatal. Therefore, I'm unworthy of acceptance or belonging. And that's where shame comes into play. And that's how it has all the power that it does. So, for example, embarrassment. Okay, I do something I'm a little embarrassed about. And looking back, it may be a little humorous and something worth laughing at. That's a lesser example of that. And is it full-blown shame? No. Shame is way out on the outer extreme. But embarrassment is fleeting, it's temporary, it happens. I think we all know that. Doesn't make it feel any better. Sitting in a restaurant and it has this great kind of wood floors on it, and you reach for your water glass and you knock off your fork and it clatters to the floor and you're sure everybody is looking at you. And that same thing is kind of this instantaneous, I'm sorry that I exist kind of thing. So embarrassment is a lesser form not fatal. I think we all, like I said, we all tend to feel it in one way or another, but it's very normal. We will look back at it and kind of chuckle. On the other hand, when we get to guilt, the guilt and shame, ultimately, the things that they have in common, okay, is self-evaluation. Another way to put it is self-spectating. In other words, I stand outside of myself and I evaluate my behavior from outside, in a sense. And it's self-monitoring. It's over the top. But guilt comes to the conclusion that I did something bad, I did something wrong, I need to correct it. That's something that is correctable. On the other hand, as we all know, shame makes the conclusion I've not only done something bad, but I am bad, and therefore, how do I come back from the edge of that? The worst part about that conclusion with shame is that if I make that conclusion that I am bad, then how can anything good come out of anything bad? And that's why that conclusion is so fatal and so powerful. It interferes with our faith even. Because if I say that I'm so bad, then how in the world can I be worthy enough for God to even save me? And I've had lots of conversations with Christians over the years that have wrestled with their faith because of their abiding belief that they are fundamentally bad. I was going to say flawed, but it's way worse than that. I mean, I've had some people actually say flatly, I'm the embodiment of evil. And some of that is because the families they came out of and what was communicated to them. And so how can God ever redeem something as evil as me? And that's a hard weaving in, if you will, of a belief system. So guilt is about our performance, and it can be adjusted and changed relatively easily. Guilt's comparing our actions, and again, I'm going over this a little quicker because I know you've read it. Guilt is comparing our actions or behaviors against ethics, values, and beliefs, and saying I can make adjustments here. And that's, I'm guilty. I recognize, according to the standard that I kept, that I'm not measuring up. I'll make every effort to do that. In the Christian terms, this is probably captured by the word conviction. And being a person of conviction is somebody, in a lot of ways, that is changing. They've got a goal in mind, and they are willing to change whatever behavior is necessary to be able to accomplish that goal. So guilt's about our performance, and I still hold that. I have had a lot of people argue with me that says, you know, and KJ Ramsey was one of them, there is such a thing as good shame, and I say, no, not today, there isn't. I know it's used in Scripture. I understand that. But the way that it's used in Scripture it was cultural then, and the way we're using it now is cultural now, and we need to contend with the way it is used now, namely within the interior universe in my head, which is, there's nothing good that comes out of it. Now, guilt motivates me and pushes me along. I think I've made this distinction with you guys before. In 2 Corinthians 7, which apparently by historical estimations is actually 3 Corinthians, Paul says, I sent you a letter and it caused you sorrow, godly sorrow that led you to life, but worldly sorrow leads to death. And those two distinctions that he makes there is that godly sorrow, guilt, conviction, leads us to life, to change, to grow, those sorts of things. Worldly sorrow leads to death, isolation, separation, condemnation. All of those things goes into worldly sorrow, which I think is the sorrow of our age, and that's shame. And I think ultimately, I think that's exactly why Brene Brown has all of the following that she does, because she's tapped into something that is very much a part of our culture, and that is how we use shame and how much it's contaminated relationships. Yeah.
Is like people pleasing, does that fall into guilt or shame, or is that just a whole nother category?
something worse, I'm sure, right, Laura?
For sure.
Well, I mean, the problem is that, you know, if a people pleaser is given feedback about that, where do they go? Usually shame. If I've made it my goal to try to keep other people pleased, then the question is what's the motivating force behind it? And a lot of times it's my conclusions about me. And so there's the fatal conclusion, in some cases at least, is I am not enough to please people on my own. So I will do everything in my effort to make sure they are pleased. And that way then I can be okay. So the core engine is very different than being kind and sensitive and attempting to be helpful to people and things like that. It's the motivation that really matters and what the engine is. So I don't think it's any other category. I think what you're talking about is kind of presentation. How do I show it? How do I show the things that I'm already concluding about myself? And a lot of times that kind of behavior always has a path back to that, you know, is that I'm trying to make sure that people don't get sideways with me, because if they do, they leave, and I'm worthy of them leaving, is really what the conclusion is. Okay. Shame is about our person. You guys all have this down, and really can't be adjusted or changed easily. It's comparing our worth or value as a person against a mythical, which is key, a mythical ideal standard of personhood, which is the conversation around perfection. So I shouldn't be this way. And the question then is what's the standard that we're talking about? Is it being a fallen, broken human being? Or is it the perfect human being that never needs anything and never makes a mistake and always gets it right and all of those sorts of things? The far and away, and any mental health professional will tell you this, that people are far more likely to engage in self-destructive behaviors because of shame, not guilt. It's always that monster in the corner. And in a lot of ways, the self-destructive behaviors, which sounds very dramatic, but it can be translated into silencing ourselves or lashing out at others and humiliating them. But see, I think in a lot of cases we choose silencing ourselves because we're not really worthy of anyone listening to us. And so that comes into the conversation, I think, that we have. This is the hard part, I think, of talking about shame, because as the title of what I'm talking about implies, when I say the comfort of shame, I don't mean that it's something I like, but it is something I know. And I would rather have the certainty of the dragon I know than the uncertainty of the angel I don't know. And shame is that dragon. And angel is that grace. And so we choose that all the time. And it a lot of times our demands for certainty are really are the driving force behind staying very stuck in a lot of cases. And that's part of what, I think we have to look at and talk about. So, okay, I'm going to stop. Any questions? All right. See you next week. Those of you in my group, I'll see you Thursday.
Start talking really scary. Not having like